The year is 1931. In the heart of Madrid, the royal palace stands under a sky heavy with the weight of change. Inside, Queen Victoria Eugenie, known to history as Queen Ena, moves through rooms she has walked 1,000 times, but tonight they feel different. The air is tense, as if the very walls know that the centuries-old Spanish monarchy is about to fall. Outside, the streets are alive with the energy of a new republic, flags and cheers filling the city in a way no royal procession ever has. For 2 decades, Ena has been queen consort to King Alfonso the Thirteenth. She entered Spain as a young British princess, a bride full of hope, determined to adapt to a new country, a new language, and a role that carried both glamour and sacrifice. She has faced public criticism for her foreign birth, endured an assassination attempt on her wedding day, and navigated the rigid formalities of court life. But nothing in her years on the throne has prepared her for this, a sudden exile, with no clear return. The decision is made quickly. Alfonso will leave Spain to prevent bloodshed. Ena has only hours to decide what to take from the palace, knowing she may never see these rooms again. Family photographs, a few jewels, important papers. Everything else will stay behind. The carriages that once carried her to grand receptions will now take her away from the life she has built. Her journey from Madrid to the French border is tense. Crowds watch, some in silence, others shouting words she cannot bear to hear. At every stop, she wonders if someone will block their path. But at last, the border is crossed, and Spain lies behind her. Ahead is not a planned future, but a blank page. Exile will last not months, but decades. She will build homes in Rome and Switzerland, living without the throne but never without the dignity of a queen. She will endure family tragedies, the death of children, the breakdown of her marriage. And yet, through art, music, charity, and the quiet shaping of her grandchildren's values, Ena will leave a legacy that outlives her. She will become the grandmother of a future king, the silent thread connecting Spain's past to its restored monarchy. Her story is one of survival, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the steady endurance of a woman who refused to be defined by loss. In a life that began in the halls of British royalty and ended far from the throne she once shared, Ena proved that grace and resilience can carry a person through even the most impossible change. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time. In this video, we are diving into the extraordinary life of Queen Ena of Spain, a queen without a throne, a woman whose exile shaped her destiny, and whose quiet strength influenced the course of Spanish history. In the spring of 1931, Spain was a country on the edge of change, and the change came suddenly. For Queen Victoria Eugenie, known as Ena, wife of King Alfonso the Thirteenth, the events unfolded with a speed and force that would alter the course of her life forever. The monarchy had stood for centuries, and though there had been political unrest and calls for reform before, there was still a sense among the royal family that their position was secure, or at least recoverable. But the municipal elections of April brought a shock. Across Spain, candidates aligned with Republican ideals won sweeping victories. While the elections were meant to be local, the results were widely interpreted as a referendum on the monarchy itself. In a matter of hours, the public mood shifted from cautious dissatisfaction to outright rejection of the royal order. Demonstrations filled the streets. Flags of the new republic appeared in cities. Crowds gathered, not to welcome their king and queen, but to see them leave. Ena, an English princess by birth who had married into the Spanish crown 2 decades earlier, was no stranger to political tension. She had faced criticism from the beginning, in part because of her Protestant background and her foreign origin. Still, she had settled into her role, learned the language, and raised a family in Madrid. She had endured personal tragedies, including an assassination attempt on her wedding day, and the challenges of raising children in a court often divided by politics and protocol. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of watching the monarchy collapse in real time. When the news became clear that the Republican victory was decisive, Alfonso decided not to resist. He announced that he was leaving Spain, though he did not formally abdicate. His reasoning was to avoid civil war and bloodshed, believing that if he stayed, confrontation between monarchist supporters and Republicans would turn violent. For Ena, the decision meant she had mere hours to prepare to leave the country she had called home for most of her adult life. The palace, once a place of ceremony and controlled order, became a hub of urgent activity. Servants whispered, courtiers rushed about, and the sound of hurried footsteps echoed in the marble halls. Every decision, what to take, what to leave, how to travel, had to be made with almost no time for reflection. There was also the question of safety. The political situation was unstable, and though there was no immediate attack on the royal family, there was always the risk of mobs, opportunists, or political vengeance. The streets outside the palace were filled with people, many celebrating the new republic, others watching to see what would happen next. The royal family's route out of Madrid had to be discreet. They could not simply drive away with a full escort in the middle of the day without drawing dangerous attention. Some of their children had already been moved to safer locations, but others were still with them. The younger ones had little understanding of what was happening. To them, it was a confusing and hurried departure from familiar rooms and routines. Ena gathered only the most essential personal belongings. Jewelry, important documents, and a few sentimental items were packed quickly. Many possessions, including clothes, books, and family mementos, would be left behind, perhaps forever. There was no time to sort or safeguard them. What had once been hers by right of possession could now be seized, sold, or simply lost. As a queen, she had once had the security of knowing that the palace's treasures were hers to use, not to guard. Now, the balance of power. The journey from Madrid to the border was tense. They traveled under a heavy sense of uncertainty. Would they be stopped? Would they be allowed to leave without harassment? The king and queen were public figures. Their faces were known across the country. Every checkpoint, every curious stare from passers-by, felt like a test. Yet there were also moments of quiet kindness along the way. People who, whatever their political beliefs, still showed a degree of respect for the family's dignity in departure. When they crossed into France, the immediate threat of arrest or confrontation was over, but the reality of exile was just beginning. Ena had entered Spain as a young bride with optimism, a sense of purpose, and a defined place in the world. Now she was leaving as a queen without a throne, stripped of her official role, her household scattered, her possessions reduced to what could be carried. There was no clear plan for where they would live, or how they would sustain the lifestyle expected of former royalty. While Alfonso had personal funds, much of their wealth was tied up in Spanish property and assets that they could no longer access. The emotional shock was sharp. For years, Ena had been accustomed to ceremony, to a set routine of public duties, to the certainty of her position in Spanish society. Now, each day would begin with the same underlying questions. Where will we be in a month? How will we keep the family together? What will become of Spain without the monarchy? She had to balance her own grief with the need to appear composed for her children. The younger ones still looked to her for stability, and even the older ones, though more aware of the situation, needed her reassurance. Practical challenges soon took shape. Finding safe, comfortable accommodation in a foreign country was not as simple as booking a room. There were security concerns, especially since political hostility could follow them across borders. There was also the problem of maintaining royal protocol without the resources of a court. Clothes had to be mended or replaced without the help of a full staff. Meals were more modest. Travel had to be arranged with care. While they had some loyal attendants, many of the palace staff had stayed behind in Spain, whether out of necessity or because they no longer had reason to follow the family into exile. Ena also had to navigate her own identity. In Spain, she had been queen consort. In England, she was a princess by birth. In exile, she was both and neither. Public perception varied. In some circles she was treated with sympathy, in others with indifference, and in still others with thinly veiled satisfaction at the monarchy's downfall. Her marriage had already been under strain due to political stress, personal differences, and the pressures of raising a family under constant scrutiny. Exile did not ease those tensions. In some ways, it amplified them. The loss of the throne also meant the loss of the platform from which Ena had supported various charitable causes in Spain. Her patronages and initiatives had been tied to her position. Now she had no formal role from which to advocate for them. This added another layer to the sense of displacement. She was not only losing a home and status, but also a purpose she had grown into over years. Despite the chaos, Ena drew on the resilience she had developed in earlier crises. She had endured personal danger, political hostility, and family challenges before. The difference now was the scale. Instead of navigating a crisis within the monarchy, she was living through its complete removal from power. It was not only the end of a chapter in her life, but the closing of an entire book. Still, in private moments, she began to think about what could come next. She was a mother first, and her immediate priority was the safety and stability of her children. That meant securing education for them, finding a permanent place to live, and keeping the family connected despite the scattering of relatives across Europe. Exile did not bring immediate peace. Political tensions in Europe were growing, and the Spanish Republic itself faced challenges that would later erupt into civil war. Ena, far from the center of events, watched from a distance as her homeland by marriage continued to change. The fall of the monarchy in 1931 had not been marked by violence, but it had nonetheless left deep marks on everyone involved. For Ena, the wound was both public and personal. Her life from that moment onward was shaped by the events of those few decisive days in April. The shock of the fall, the hurried departure, the uncertain road to France, all of it became part of her memory and identity. She had lost the crown, but not the instinct to endure. In that sense, her spirit remained unbroken. It was not the life she had chosen, but it was the life she now had to make work, for herself and for the family that still depended on her. After the hurried departure from Spain and the tense journey across the border into France, Ena and Alfonso were faced with the difficult reality that there was no simple way back to the life they had known. The monarchy had not been overthrown through bloodshed, but it had been decisively rejected by the public, and there was no sign that political winds would turn in their favor anytime soon. What they faced now was not a temporary absence from home, but an open-ended exile. For Ena, this meant accepting that her days as Queen Consort of Spain were over in any formal sense. She had gone from a woman whose calendar was dictated by state occasions, court protocol, and public duties to one who had to decide, from day to day, how to structure her time. It was both disorienting and, in rare moments, strangely liberating. In the early months, the family moved between temporary accommodations in France and Italy, always seeking a balance between security, privacy, and access to the resources they still had. Alfonso had chosen Rome as his primary base, in part because of his close ties to the Italian royal family, who offered him hospitality. Ena joined him there for extended periods, though she also spent significant time in Switzerland, particularly in the canton of Vaud, where the quiet lakeside towns offered a degree of calm far removed from the political turbulence of southern Europe. Over time, these places became her sanctuaries. Rome gave her connection to the familiar rhythms of a royal environment: formal dinners, visits from dignitaries, and the kind of structured society she understood instinctively. Switzerland, on the other hand, gave her something rarer: a slower pace, cleaner air, and a sense of neutrality in a continent increasingly fractured by ideological conflict. She adapted her surroundings carefully. In Rome, she created a home that retained some of the elegance of Madrid's royal apartments without the weight of ceremonial obligations. In Switzerland, she embraced a more understated style, filling her rooms with family photographs, comfortable chairs, and books rather than grand symbols of monarchy. These were not palaces, but they were safe, dignified spaces in which she could receive her children and later, her grandchildren. Her role as a mother had shifted dramatically since the exile began. In Spain, her children had been raised in the strict and public environment of court life, with tutors, governesses, and carefully managed appearances. In exile, the need for protection and stability overrode all else. She focused on keeping the family connected even as the children grew older and began to follow their own paths. Some entered into marriages that carried political implications, while others struggled to find direction outside the shadow of the throne. Ena encouraged them where she could, but she also had to watch them make choices she could not control. Her position as a grandmother brought her a quieter kind of fulfillment. By the mid-1930s, she welcomed the first of her grandchildren, and in them she found both joy and a reminder of what she had lost. The young ones knew her not as a reigning queen, but as a figure of family warmth who told stories of a Spain they had never known. She became a steady presence for them, keeping family traditions alive in small ways, through food, holiday customs, and the sharing of memories. Still, exile was not without its difficulties. Financially, Ena was no longer in the position she had once been. Much of the wealth associated with the monarchy had remained in Spain, and though she had personal assets, maintaining 2 residences while helping her children required careful management. Her life was comfortable, but no longer lavish. She became accustomed to modest economies, reusing gowns, managing household staff more sparingly, and limiting large social gatherings to special occasions. In this stripped-down life, Ena found a new kind of routine. Without the obligations of court, she was free to rise at her own pace, though habit often drew her to the same structured mornings she had kept in Madrid. Breakfast was followed by correspondence, as she maintained a wide circle of friends and relations across Europe. Letters from England, Italy, and even from monarchist supporters still in Spain arrived regularly, keeping her connected to a world she could no longer enter directly. She read the newspapers closely, following political developments in Spain with a mix of interest and guarded hope, though she was careful not to indulge in unrealistic expectations of restoration. Afternoons were often devoted to charitable work, though on a smaller scale than before. Ena continued to support causes related to nursing and children's welfare, writing letters of support, sending small contributions, and attending occasional events where her presence was still considered an honor. In Rome, she was sometimes invited to attend official occasions with the Italian royal family, and though she was careful to keep a low profile, these appearances reminded her that she still held a respected place in certain circles. Evenings varied. In Rome, they might include formal dinners with visiting relatives or trusted friends, filled with conversation about politics, family, and the shifting alliances of Europe. In Switzerland, they were quieter, simple meals, reading by the fire, sometimes hosting small gatherings of neighbors or family passing through. The change of pace between these two worlds suited her. Rome kept her engaged with the kind of social life she had known as queen, while Switzerland gave her the chance to retreat, reflect, and find peace. Her sense of purpose now came not from a nation, but from the family she could still guide. Ena was aware that, without the throne, the unity of the family was not guaranteed. Marriages, political differences, and personal ambitions could scatter them across the continent. She took it upon herself to be the anchor, encouraging her children to visit her regularly, mediating disputes quietly, and reminding them of their shared history. In doing so, she preserved a sense of identity that might otherwise have faded in exile. The years in Rome and Switzerland passed with this rhythm, sometimes interrupted by larger events. The rise of political extremism in Europe in the late 1930s and the approach of another world war brought new challenges. Switzerland's neutrality offered safety, but it also meant greater isolation from much of the continent. Travel became more complicated, communication less certain. Ena adjusted once again, relying more on her Swiss residence during times of tension and making her Roman visits shorter and less frequent. As the decades went on, she became more reflective about her time as queen. She did not speak often in public about the fall of the monarchy, but in private she sometimes admitted that she had been unprepared for the speed with which it had ended. There was a quiet acceptance in her tone, a recognition that history had taken its course. Yet she also carried a certain pride that, even in the face of political rejection, she had maintained dignity and composure. Her sense of self was no longer tied to the crown. It was tied to her resilience, her adaptability, and the relationships she had preserved. By the time her grandchildren were old enough to understand who she had once been, she was living a life that bore little resemblance to her years in Madrid. The jewels were worn less often, the formal gowns taken out only on rare occasions. She dressed with elegance but without ostentation, favoring clothes that were well-made and timeless rather than flashy. Her manner remained regal, but it was softened by the absence of courtly formality. Visitors often remarked that she seemed more approachable in exile than she had been in Spain, more inclined to share personal stories and to laugh without concern for public image. Her homes in Rome and Switzerland became more than just residences. They were living symbols of her adaptability. Rome represented continuity with the royal world, a place where she could still engage in the rituals and conversations of her upbringing and married life. Switzerland represented survival and renewal, a place where she could build a quieter existence away from the demands of public expectation. In both places, she found ways to weave together past and present, surrounding herself with reminders of Spain while embracing the realities of her new life. Ena's later years in exile were not marked by dramatic events, but by a steady, deliberate shaping of her own narrative. She was no longer the Queen of Spain, but she was not willing to become a figure defined only by loss. Instead, she positioned herself as a matriarch, a custodian of memory, and a living connection between past and future generations of her family. She remained, in her own way, a queen, though her throne now was a comfortable chair in a drawing room, and her court consisted of children, grandchildren, and the few loyal friends who had followed her across the shifting map of Europe. The years that followed Ena's settling into her new life in Rome and Switzerland were far from peaceful. Though she had created a routine and built a semblance of stability in exile, The comfort of a quiet household could not shield her from the private tragedies that would test her spirit more than political upheaval ever had. If the fall of the Spanish monarchy had taken her crown, the next decades would take parts of her heart. As a mother, she had always carried the worries of her children's health and happiness, but in exile those worries became constant companions. From the earliest years of her marriage, Ena had faced the cruel reality that hemophilia, the hereditary blood disorder that had run through her own family line as a granddaughter of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, had entered the Spanish royal house through her. Her second son, Jaime, had been born without the disorder but suffered severe hearing loss after an operation. Several of her other sons were not spared. Her eldest, Alfonso, Prince of Asturias, was diagnosed with hemophilia as a child, and his life was a delicate balance between protecting him from injury and letting him live with dignity. In Madrid, the palace could offer some degree of control over his environment, but in exile, the risks seemed greater, the protective network smaller. Every trip, every physical activity, carried the shadow of danger. The disease shaped the family's decisions in countless ways. Alfonso had been heir to the throne, but his condition and a later personal decision to renounce his rights to marry a woman not of royal blood altered his place in the line of succession. Ena had accepted his choice with understanding, knowing that he deserved happiness even if it meant further complicating the monarchy's future. Yet the joy she felt for his marriage was short-lived. In the late 1930s, he died tragically young in a car accident in the United States, an event that struck Ena with a force that no previous loss had equaled. The news reached her while she was in Switzerland, and the shock left her momentarily unable to speak. She had endured public disappointment and political rejection before, but the death of a child was a private wound that could not be softened by dignity or duty. Her grief was compounded by the loss of her youngest son, Gonzalo, who also suffered from hemophilia. He had been only in his teens when the monarchy fell, and she had been particularly protective of him in exile. Despite her care, his life was cut short in his early 20s after a minor accident triggered fatal bleeding. The cruel randomness of the disease, how an event that would be harmless for most could become deadly for him, tormented her. For Ena, there was no solace in thinking that it was fate. She blamed herself at times, knowing that the genetic line had come through her. Her second son, Jaime, though spared the blood disorder, faced his own struggles. His severe hearing impairment had made life in the public eye more difficult, and relations between him and the rest of the family were not always smooth. He eventually renounced his rights to the throne, and while Ena did not publicly criticize him, the decision marked another fracture in the family's royal lineage. Her third son, Juan, Count of Barcelona, remained the primary hope for a restoration, but his path was filled with political obstacles and the same uncertainty that had shadowed their lives since 1931. Her daughters, Beatriz and Maria Cristina, provided comfort and companionship, but even they were not spared challenges. Marriages took them far from her for long stretches, and though she cherished her role as grandmother, the distances meant she could not be present for every milestone. The scattering of her family across Europe was a constant reminder of how exile had dismantled the closeness they might have had in Spain. All of this unfolded against the backdrop of her increasingly separate life from Alfonso the 13th. In the early years of exile, they had remained in closer contact, living part of the time in the same city, if not always in the same household. But their marriage, strained long before the fall of the monarchy, grew more distant with each passing year. Alfonso's personal life had been marked by infidelities even during their reign, and in exile he did not change. Ena's own nature was reserved and dutiful. She endured rather than confronted, keeping her private feelings tightly guarded. Eventually, the couple lived largely apart, she dividing her time between Switzerland and occasional visits to Rome, he surrounded by his own circle of companions. Despite their distance, the two shared a bond that came from their children and the shared experience of losing the throne. When tragedy struck one of their sons, they were drawn together in mourning, if only temporarily. Publicly, she never spoke ill of him, and even in private she rarely let bitterness surface. For her, dignity meant controlling the narrative of her life, and that included avoiding public displays of marital discord. Whatever her personal disappointments, she understood the importance of presenting unity in moments when the family was under scrutiny. The public image she maintained was one of composure and grace, and it was not a facade in the shallow sense. It was the outward expression of an inner discipline she had cultivated since her youth. Even in grief, she dressed impeccably, carried herself with regal posture, and spoke with measured calm. In photographs from this period, her face carries traces of sadness, but there is no collapse, no surrender to self-pity. This was partly for her children and grandchildren, who looked to her as a symbol of stability, and partly for herself. Maintaining her public image was a way of holding on to a sense of identity that exile and loss had threatened to strip away. Her days were shaped by a balance between solitude and connection. In Switzerland, she walked regularly along the lakeshore, the stillness of the water offering a quiet space to think. In Rome, she allowed herself to be drawn into small gatherings, dinners, and the occasional formal event with the Italian royal family or visiting dignitaries. When in public, she remained unfailingly courteous, often engaging in polite but guarded conversations about Spain, avoiding political speculation. Those who knew her well understood that she carried grief close, but that she preferred to express it through private remembrance rather than open lament. The losses of her sons weighed heavily in her later years. Birthdays and anniversaries of their deaths were marked quietly, sometimes with a private mass, sometimes simply with prayer. Ena was deeply religious, and her faith became more central as tragedies accumulated. The rituals of the church provided structure and a form of solace that nothing else could. She found comfort in the belief that she would one day be reunited with those she had lost, and that her own trials were part of a larger design beyond human understanding. Even with the undercurrent of grief, she did not retreat entirely from life. Her grandchildren brought moments of joy and distraction, and she made deliberate efforts to be present for them. She told them stories of their fathers and uncles, ensuring that even those who had died young remained part of the family's living memory. These stories were not sentimental embellishments. She spoke with honesty about their characters, their challenges, and the courage they had shown in the face of illness. Her role as the quiet center of the family became more defined as the years passed. She could not undo the past or change the circumstances that had brought them into exile, but she could ensure that the family name carried a certain dignity, untainted by scandal or public spectacle. That commitment shaped her interactions with the press, her careful avoidance of political disputes, and her insistence on maintaining propriety even in private gatherings. By the time Alfonso the Thirteenth's health began to fail in the early 1940s, their lives had been largely separating for years. She visited him in his final illness, and despite all that had passed between them, she offered comfort and companionship in his last days. His death in Rome in 1941 was another deep loss, though it was more the passing of a shared history than the breaking of a close daily bond. She mourned him sincerely, as the father of her children and the man with whom she had navigated both the grandeur and the collapse of a throne. In the years after his death, Ena's solitude increased, but so did her resolve. She remained in Switzerland for much of the time, occasionally traveling to visit her children and grandchildren. Her days were simple but purposeful, correspondence, reading, walks, and quiet evenings by the fire. She continued to dress elegantly, to attend Mass regularly, and to keep her household running with quiet efficiency. In her presence, there was still something unmistakably queenly, even without the crown. She had known public triumph and humiliation, personal joy and devastating loss. Through it all, she had chosen composure over display, discipline over indulgence. Those who met her in her later years often remarked on the calm strength in her bearing, the sense that here was a woman who had lived through history's storms without letting them define her completely. The tragedies of her children's illnesses and deaths, the complexities of her marriage, and the unending reality of exile had shaped her deeply, but they had not broken her. Her crown might have been taken, but her dignity remained entirely her own. In the years after Alfonso's death, Ena's life settled into a rhythm that was quieter but still rich in meaning. Though she no longer occupied a throne or held an official position, she was far from idle. Freed from the endless demands of court protocol, she could now devote time to pursuits that had long been personal sources of joy and comfort. These were not new passions, but in exile they took on deeper significance. They were, in a sense, her way of reclaiming parts of herself that had been overshadowed by public duty. Art had been a thread running through her life since her youth in England. As a young princess, she had been exposed to painting, sculpture, and decorative arts through both formal instruction and the cultivated tastes of her royal relatives. In Madrid, her role as queen had brought her into contact with Spain's rich artistic heritage, from the works of Velázquez and Goya to contemporary Spanish painters. She had presided over exhibitions, attended openings, and supported restoration projects, but much of that had been a matter of public obligation. In Switzerland and Rome, however, she engaged with art on her own terms. She visited small galleries where she could move quietly from piece to piece without the press of photographers or the stiff formality of an entourage. She collected modest works that appealed to her personally, favoring landscapes and portraits that spoke of intimacy and place rather than grandeur. Music was perhaps an even more constant companion. She had been trained in piano as a girl, and though her skills were modest, she found great satisfaction in playing privately. In exile, especially in Switzerland, she would sit at the piano in the late afternoon, playing softly for herself or for whichever family members or guests happened to be present. Classical works by Beethoven, Schubert, and Chopin filled her repertoire, alongside the occasional Spanish folk melody that carried memories of her years in Madrid. In Rome, she attended concerts whenever possible, often slipping into a box seat with a trusted friend to enjoy a performance away from public attention. These evenings offered her both cultural enrichment and a sense of continuity with the life she had once known, when music had been woven into court ceremonies and private gatherings alike. Philanthropy, too, remained a cornerstone of her identity. Even stripped of official patronages, she continued to find ways to contribute to causes she cared about. Nursing and children's welfare had been among her principal concerns as queen, and she maintained those connections in exile. In Switzerland, she volunteered her time in discreet ways, helping to organize small fundraisers, contributing to hospitals, and offering her name, quietly, without fanfare, to lend weight to charitable appeals. She did not seek public recognition for this work, and many of her contributions went unreported in the press. For her, these acts were both an expression of duty and a way of staying connected to the world beyond her immediate family. In this more private phase of her life, Ena also cultivated relationships that were markedly different from the formal associations of her years on the throne. Her circle of close friends included a mix of aristocrats, expatriates, and a few individuals from outside the nobility altogether. These were people she could speak to without the layers of ceremony that had once defined her interactions. Some were companions from her youth, others had been met in exile, bound together by shared displacement and the peculiar freedom it brought. In their company, she could share personal stories, laugh without reserve, and even speak candidly about her feelings toward the events that had shaped her life. One of her closest friendships in Switzerland was with a widowed countess who had fled political turmoil in her own country. The two women would walk together along the lake, discussing books they were reading or news from their scattered families. Another friendship, in Rome, was with a musician who occasionally played duets with her on the piano. These connections were grounded in mutual respect and trust, offering Ena something that court life had rarely allowed: genuine intimacy uncolored by political calculation. Her hobbies, though modest in scale, became small sanctuaries of peace. Gardening was one of them. In Switzerland, she tended a modest plot outside her home, planting seasonal flowers and keeping a few rose bushes that she pruned herself. The act of working with her hands, of nurturing something and watching it grow, provided a simple, tangible satisfaction. It was a world away from the abstractions of politics or the constant vigilance of royal life. She would often cut fresh flowers to bring indoors, arranging them herself in vases, a quiet pleasure she never delegated to a servant. Reading, too, was a lifelong habit that deepened in these later years. Her tastes ranged widely, from biographies and histories to novels, especially those with strong characters navigating moral and personal challenges. She had a particular fondness for English literature, which kept her connected to her homeland, but she also read in French and Spanish, a reflection of her multilingual life. Books were often discussed with visiting friends or family, and she sometimes marked passages to share in conversation, a habit that revealed her desire to engage with ideas as much as with people. Embroidery was another pastime that connected her to earlier stages of her life. As a girl, she had been taught needlework as part of her education, and though it was a skill she had used less frequently during her years in Madrid, in exile it resurfaced as a calming, almost meditative activity. She would work on small pieces, table linens, decorative cushions, often giving them as gifts to her children or grandchildren. The work was careful and deliberate, each stitch a small act of creation in a life where so much had been beyond her control. These personal pursuits did more than fill her time. They gave her a framework for living in a world that had been stripped of the structure of royal duties. Art, music, charity, and friendship offered her both solace and purpose. They were reminders that even without a throne, life could be shaped by beauty, kindness, and meaningful connection. To outsiders, she might have seemed a figure of calm detachment, but those who knew her well understood that she invested her energy in these private passions with quiet intensity. Her ability to find joy in these small, personal endeavors was closely tied to her resilience. Having endured the loss of the monarchy, the scattering of her family, the deaths of her children, and the gradual fading of her marriage, she could have retreated into isolation. Instead, she chose to engage with the world on her own terms, creating spaces, both physical and emotional, where she could live with dignity and a measure of contentment. This life beyond the public also allowed her to define herself in ways that had little to do with her former title. She was still addressed as queen in certain circles, still treated with the deference due to her birth and marriage, but in her private spaces, she was simply Ena, a woman with a piano, a garden, a shelf of books, and a group of trusted friends. These were the things that sustained her in the long years of exile, offering not just distraction from loss, but a way of building a life that was whole in its own right. In time, these quiet passions would become the essence of her later legacy. Not the dramatic events of her youth, nor the ceremonies of her reign, but the steady grace with which she lived after all of that was gone. Those who visited her in Switzerland or Rome would remember the warmth of her hospitality, the sincerity of her interest in their lives, and the sense of calm that seemed to infuse her surroundings. In this way, she created a lasting impression that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with character. By the time Ena entered the last chapter of her life, the world around her had changed almost beyond recognition. The political map of Europe had been redrawn more than once since she had left Madrid in the spring of 1931. 2 world wars had altered the course of nations and the fates of royal houses. New republics had risen, old empires had fallen, and monarchies that once seemed as permanent as stone had vanished into history. Through all of it, Ena had remained in exile, her name tied to a Spain she could not return to, and her life shaped by the absence of the crown that had once defined her public identity. Yet if the fall of the monarchy had removed her from power, it had also allowed her to reveal qualities that were perhaps less visible when she wore the title of queen. Her years in Switzerland and Rome had gradually transformed her public image. In the early days after the monarchy's fall, she had been seen by many Spaniards as a foreign-born queen who had not fully belonged to the national soul, a figure associated with the failures of the old order. But as decades passed, the bitterness of those final days in Madrid softened. For those who remembered her from her reign, and for a new generation who only knew her as the elderly widow of Alfonso the 13th, she came to be seen as a figure of quiet endurance. She had not fought her way back into political prominence or sought public sympathy through displays of hardship. Instead, she had lived steadily, graciously, without scandal or desperate bids for relevance. This, in its own way, became the source of her respectability. People who visited her in later years often remarked on the atmosphere she created in her home, whether in the lakeside calm of her Swiss residence or in her more formal Roman surroundings. There was a sense of order and serenity, not born from luxury alone, but from her discipline and her insistence on dignity. She remained attentive to her appearance, dressed with understated elegance, and spoke with the measured tone that had characterized her since her youth. Even in informal moments, she carried herself in a way that reminded visitors she had once been a queen, though she no longer had a throne. Her influence was felt most intimately in her family, especially among her grandchildren. Many of them knew her not as the central figure in a court, but as the matriarch who provided continuity in a scattered and sometimes uncertain family. She made sure that her grandchildren understood where they came from, not simply the lineage and titles, but the traditions, values, and responsibilities that came with their heritage. She told them stories of their fathers and uncles, of Madrid before exile, of the way ceremonies were conducted, and the way people once looked to the monarchy for stability. She did not romanticize the past, but she kept it alive in their imaginations. Her grandson Juan Carlos, who would one day become King of Spain, was among those shaped by her quiet presence. She was not directly involved in political maneuvering, but her example spoke volumes about the kind of personal discipline and sense of duty that would be required of any monarch in a changing world. She had known the weight of public expectation, the limits of personal freedom that came with the crown, and the reality that a sovereign must sometimes bear unpopularity with composure. Without lecturing, she passed on these lessons through her manner, her restraint, and her unwavering sense of identity. Even in the years when restoration of the Spanish monarchy seemed a distant hope, Ena carried herself as though the dignity of the crown still mattered. This was not stubborn nostalgia, but a deliberate choice. For her, the monarchy was not merely a political institution. It was a symbol of continuity, culture, and service. By living in a way that honored those ideals, she kept them alive in the hearts of her descendants. When, decades after her exile began, the monarchy was restored in Spain under Juan Carlos, it was in part the result of a legacy of conduct and belief that Ena had helped to preserve. Her later life was not without further sorrows, illnesses, the loss of friends, and the inevitable loneliness that comes when one outlives so many of one's contemporaries. Yet she met these challenges with the same reserve and grace she had shown in earlier trials. Those close to her spoke of her ability to keep her emotions in balance, to acknowledge grief without allowing it to overtake her. This was not coldness, but a form of strength she had cultivated over a lifetime. It was the same quality that had allowed her to stand upright in 1931 when the world she knew fell away in a single day. Her legacy was also shaped by the fact that she never attempted to rewrite her history. She did not seek to justify every decision made during her time as queen, nor did she dwell on the injustices she may have felt in exile. She accepted, as few in her position could, that history had moved on. What mattered was how one lived after the tide had turned. In her case, that meant maintaining her faith, her sense of self, and her devotion to family. In the small, personal world she inhabited in her later years, she found satisfaction in the routines and passions she had cultivated: art, music, gardening, reading, and charitable acts. These things, modest in scale but rich in meaning, became the threads that bound together the decades of her exile. They were reminders that identity is not only shaped by titles and public roles, but by the way one spends unobserved hours, the way one treats friends, and the way one responds to life's inevitable losses. The image of Ena in her final years was far removed from the young bride who had entered Madrid amid pageantry, or the embattled queen who had left under the shadow of a republic's victory. She was, instead, a woman who had weathered more than half a century of change without losing her essential composure. She had been a queen without a throne, a mother in grief, a wife in a marriage often marked by distance, and a widow who managed her own affairs with quiet competence. When she died in 1969 in Lausanne, Switzerland, it was in the same spirit that had guided her life since exile, without drama, with dignity intact, and surrounded by the small circle of family who had been her constant concern. Her passing marked the end of an era in more ways than one. She was one of the last living links to the pre-Republican Spanish monarchy, to a world where royal protocol still shaped daily life, and where the figure of the queen consort carried both symbolic and practical weight. Her funeral, though not a grand state occasion, was attended by representatives of royal houses from across Europe, as well as members of the Spanish royal family. It was a recognition not of political power, but of personal stature. She was laid to rest in Spain, the country she had entered as a foreign princess, served as queen, and left in forced exile nearly 4 decades earlier. In her return, even in death, there was a kind of reconciliation, a closing of the long circle of her life. In the years since, her story has been remembered in different ways. Historians have debated her influence on Spanish politics during her reign, some seeing her as a figure constrained by circumstance, others as a woman whose quiet counsel mattered more than records show. Biographers have been drawn to the contrast between her turbulent public years and her remarkably steady private ones. Within her family, however, she is remembered less for political controversy than for the qualities that sustained her: her discipline, her loyalty, her refusal to be diminished by loss. Her enduring legacy rests on more than her royal title. It rests on the image of a woman who could adapt without surrendering her values, who could grieve without collapsing, and who could live meaningfully even when stripped of the role that had once given her life its official purpose. She left behind not only descendants who would carry forward the Spanish monarchy, but also an example of how to navigate change with honor. Looking back over the arc of her life, from her birth into the British royal family, through her marriage and queenship, to her long exile and final years, it is difficult to imagine a path more shaped by forces beyond her control. Yet within those constraints, she carved out a life that was distinctly her own. She was not a monarch in exile who clung desperately to past glories, but a woman who found ways to live fully in the present while still honoring her past. For those who study her life, perhaps the most striking lesson is that resilience is not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it is the quiet choice to rise each morning, tend the garden, write the letters, play the piano, and greet the day with the same calm dignity as the one before. Ena's life in exile was not the life she had imagined, but it was the life she lived with grace, and in doing so, she left behind a legacy that outlasted the political storms that had once seemed all-consuming. Her story remains a testament to the fact that the loss of a crown need not mean the loss of self. The image of her, silver-haired, poised, and unshaken by the long years between Madrid and Lausanne, stands as a reminder that strength can take many forms, and that dignity, once chosen, can endure through even the most impossible changes.